The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace sparkled under the light of massive crystal chandeliers. Tonight was the annual Commonwealth Gala, one of the most important events on the royal calendar. Diplomats, politicians, celebrities, and members of the royal family had gathered for an evening of formal dinner, speeches, and cultural performances. The air buzzed with polite conversation in multiple languages as guests moved elegantly across the marble floor. Kate Middleton stood near the entrance, greeting guests with her characteristic warm smile. She wore a stunning navy blue gown that complemented her sapphire earrings, the same ones that once belonged to Princess Diana. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, and, despite the formal setting, she managed to make each guest feel personally welcomed. This was what she did best, connecting with people, making them feel comfortable even in the most intimidating royal settings. But something was different tonight. Kate felt an unusual heaviness in her chest, a sensation she had been ignoring for weeks. The pressure of recent royal duties had been mounting. The past month had been particularly demanding with back-to-back engagements, charity visits, and state functions. She had been pushing herself harder than usual, determined to prove herself worthy of her future role as queen consort. William noticed his wife's slight fatigue during their morning briefing, but Kate had insisted she was fine. She had a tendency to downplay her own needs, always putting duty first. It was one of the qualities he admired most about her, but it also worried him. He knew the weight of royal responsibility could be overwhelming, even for someone as naturally suited to it as Kate. The evening schedule was packed. After the reception, there would be a formal dinner with 7 courses, followed by speeches from various Commonwealth leaders, and then a cultural performance featuring artists from different member nations. Kate was expected to engage meaningfully with dozens of important guests throughout the evening, remembering personal details about their families, their country's current situations, and their previous conversations. As she moved through the crowd, Kate's mind felt slightly foggy. She found herself having to concentrate harder than usual to follow conversations. When the Canadian Prime Minister mentioned his daughter's recent graduation, Kate had to pause for a moment to remember their previous discussion about the young woman's medical studies. These were the kinds of personal details that usually came to her effortlessly. The receiving line seemed endless tonight. Each handshake, each polite exchange, each smile required more effort than it should have. Kate's personal secretary, Amanda, noticed her employer's slightly slower pace, but attributed it to the formal nature of the evening. The protocol for such events was always more rigid, requiring careful attention to precedence and proper introductions. Prince William worked the room with practiced ease, but his eyes kept returning to Kate. Something in her posture seemed different tonight. She was maintaining her composure perfectly. No one else would notice anything amiss. But William had learned to read the subtle signs after years of marriage. The way she held her shoulders slightly higher than usual, the extra beat she took before responding to questions, the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. The palace staff moved efficiently around them, ensuring glasses were filled, canapes were circulated, and every guest felt properly attended to. The royal protection officers maintained their discreet positions throughout the room, constantly scanning for any potential issues while remaining nearly invisible to the guests. The evening was proceeding exactly as planned, with military precision that characterized all major royal events. Kate engaged in a lengthy conversation with the Australian High Commissioner about recent environmental initiatives in the Pacific region. She was genuinely interested in the topic. Environmental conservation was one of her key areas of focus, but she found herself struggling to maintain the level of detailed discussion she would normally excel at. Her responses were appropriate, but lacked her usual depth and insight. During a brief moment between conversations, Kate stepped slightly toward one of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. The cool glass felt refreshing against her gloved hand as she pretended to admire the view. In reality, she was taking a moment to steady herself. The room felt warmer than usual, and she could feel a light perspiration forming despite the palace's perfectly controlled climate. A senior aide approached with the evening's revised timeline. There had been a small adjustment to accommodate a last-minute addition to the guest list, a young climate activist from Bangladesh who had recently won international recognition. Kate would need to spend extra time with her, discussing the activist's work and the challenges facing young environmental leaders in South Asia. Kate nodded and smiled, accepting the change gracefully as she always did. Flexibility was crucial in royal work. Last-minute adjustments were more common than the public realized. She made a mental note to review the briefing materials about Bangladesh's current environmental policies, information that had been thoroughly covered in her preparation sessions earlier in the week. The dinner bell chimed softly, and guests began moving toward the state dining room. Kate took William's arm as they led the procession, following the careful choreography that had been rehearsed that morning. The dining room looked magnificent, with its long table set for 80 guests, featuring the George IV State Service, gold plates, and elaborate centerpieces that transformed the meal into a work of art. As they walked, Kate's breathing felt slightly labored, though she maintained her composure perfectly. The weight of her gown, which had felt comfortable during the fitting, now seemed heavier. She focused on placing one foot in front of the other, maintaining the graceful glide that years of royal training had perfected. The seating arrangement had been meticulously planned, with Kate positioned between the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth and the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Both were engaging conversationalists, and she looked forward to their discussions about trade relationships and cultural exchange programs. These were topics she found genuinely interesting, areas where she could contribute meaningfully to important international relationships. William took his seat across from her, positioned between the High Commissioner of India and a prominent businesswoman from Kenya who had been honored for her work in sustainable development. Even from across the table, he could observe Kate's interactions, ready to smoothly intervene if needed, though he doubted it would be necessary. Kate was exceptionally skilled at managing challenging social situations. The first course arrived, a delicate soup featuring ingredients from various Commonwealth nations. Kate lifted her spoon, grateful for the relatively simple requirement of eating soup versus managing more complex dishes while maintaining conversation. The warm liquid felt soothing, and, for a moment, she felt her energy returning. The Secretary-General asked about her recent visit to Scotland, where she had opened a new children's hospital. Kate brightened as she described meeting the young patients and their families, the innovative treatment programs, and the dedicated medical staff. These were the moments that made all the protocol and formality worthwhile, the real impact they could have on people's lives. But, as the evening progressed through subsequent courses, Kate began to feel that familiar heaviness returning. The conversations required constant attention and thoughtful responses. Every comment needed to be diplomatically phrased, culturally sensitive, and substantive enough to advance important relationships. The mental energy required was enormous, though she had developed these skills over years of practice. The main course featured lamb from Wales with vegetables representing different Commonwealth regions. Kate managed to eat appropriately while continuing her conversation about educational initiatives in the Pacific Islands. She was genuinely interested in learning about innovative teaching methods being developed for remote island communities, but maintaining focus required more effort than usual. Between the main course and dessert, there was a traditional toast to the Commonwealth and its shared values. Kate rose with the other guests, raising her crystal glass as William delivered brief remarks about unity, cooperation, and shared prosperity. His words were eloquent and heartfelt, reflecting his deep commitment to the Commonwealth's mission and its member nations. As they sat back down, Kate felt a slight dizziness that she attributed to standing up quickly. She discreetly gripped the edge of the table for a moment, steadying herself while maintaining her attentive expression. The dessert course was being served, an elaborate creation featuring tropical fruits from Caribbean member nations. The evening was approaching its climax, with speeches scheduled to follow dessert. Kate would need to deliver brief remarks about women's empowerment initiatives across the Commonwealth, a topic she was passionate about and had researched extensively. She had practiced her speech that morning, feeling confident about its content and delivery. But, as the final course was cleared and the formal program began, Kate realized that the challenging part of the evening was still ahead. The speeches, the cultural performance, and the informal mingling that would follow would require several more hours of intense focus and energy. She took a deep breath and smiled warmly at her dinner companions, preparing herself for the demands ahead. The stage was set for what would become one of the most memorable evenings in recent royal history, though not for the reasons anyone anticipated. The carefully planned event was about to take an unexpected turn that would test not only Kate's resilience, but also the deep bond between her and William, demonstrating the personal side of their very public partnership. The Commonwealth Secretary-General rose to begin the evening's formal speeches, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed dining room. Kate arranged her expression into one of attentive interest, though internally, she was fighting an increasing sense of fatigue that seemed to be settling deeper into her bones with each passing minute. The first speaker discussed economic cooperation between member nations, outlining new trade initiatives that would benefit smaller island states. Kate nodded at appropriate moments, maintaining the engaged demeanor expected of her position. But the words seemed to drift in and out of focus, requiring her to concentrate harder than usual to follow the complex economic discussions. William, speaking with the Kenyan businesswoman beside him about sustainable agriculture projects, noticed Kate's stillness. She was sitting straighter than usual, her hands perfectly positioned, but there was something almost too controlled about her posture. In their private moments, Kate was naturally animated, using gestures to emphasize points and shifting position frequently. This rigid composure was her professional mask, but tonight it seemed more pronounced. The second speaker, representing the youth climate activists, delivered passionate remarks about environmental challenges facing young people across the Commonwealth. Kate found herself genuinely moved by the young woman's eloquent description of rising sea levels threatening her island home. This was exactly the kind of advocacy that Kate supported through her royal platform. But even this topic that usually energized her felt distant tonight. During the polite applause between speeches, Kate reached for her water glass, grateful for the brief respite. The cool liquid helped clear her throat, though it did little for the underlying fatigue that seemed to be spreading through her system. She glanced at the program discreetly, 3 more speakers before her own remarks. Then, the cultural performance. The Australian representative began discussing Indigenous rights and cultural preservation. Kate had visited several Aboriginal communities during their tour of Australia, experiences that had deeply impacted her understanding of colonial history and contemporary challenges. She should have been fully engaged with these important topics, but instead found herself struggling to maintain focus. A server quietly refilled water glasses around the table, the staff moving with practiced silence to avoid disturbing the speeches. Kate was grateful for the fresh water, though she noticed her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the glass. She attributed this to the emotional weight of the speeches rather than any physical concern. The Indian High Commissioner delivered moving remarks about healthcare initiatives for rural communities, describing mobile medical units that brought services to remote villages. Kate had personally visited similar programs during their tour of India, meeting mothers who had traveled great distances to access basic healthcare for their children. These were the human stories that made royal work meaningful. But, tonight, even these powerful narratives felt filtered through a growing haze. Kate maintained her expression of concerned interest, nodding at appropriate moments, and occasionally making brief notes on the small pad beside her place setting. To any observer, she appeared fully engaged with the important discussions taking place. William delivered the 4th speech of the evening, speaking eloquently about youth leadership and educational opportunities. Kate felt a surge of pride watching her husband articulate their shared vision for Commonwealth cooperation. His words were thoughtful and inspiring, reflecting genuine passion for the topics he addressed. She managed to smile warmly when he glanced in her direction during his closing remarks. The applause that followed William's speech seemed unusually loud to Kate, though she joined in enthusiastically. As the sound faded, she realized it would soon be her turn to address the gathering. Her speech about women's empowerment was carefully prepared, focusing on success stories from across the Commonwealth and outlining new initiatives to support female entrepreneurs in developing nations. Kate had delivered similar speeches many times before, often without notes, drawing on her extensive knowledge of the programs and personal connections with women she had met during various royal tours. Tonight, however, she found herself more dependent on her written remarks than usual, grateful for the detailed preparation her staff had provided. The Master of Ceremonies introduced Kate with the formal titles and acknowledgments required by protocol. As she rose from her seat, Kate felt a momentary unsteadiness that she quickly corrected, placing her hand briefly on the table for support. The movement was subtle enough that most guests didn't notice, though William's attention immediately sharpened. Standing at the podium, Kate looked out over the distinguished gathering. The faces before her included some of the most influential leaders in the Commonwealth, people who could affect real change in their communities and nations. This was her opportunity to advocate for causes she cared deeply about, to use her platform for meaningful impact. Her opening remarks flowed smoothly, thanking the guests for their attendance and acknowledging the important work being done across member nations. Kate's voice was clear and confident, betraying none of the internal struggle she was experiencing. Years of public speaking training allowed her to project warmth and authority even when she felt less than her best. She began describing a microcredit program in Bangladesh that was helping women start small businesses, sharing the story of a young mother who had expanded from selling vegetables in her village market to supplying produce to several neighboring towns. Kate had met this woman during a royal visit, and their conversation had stayed with her long after returning to London. But, as she continued speaking, Kate began to notice that the words on her prepared remarks seemed to blur slightly. She blinked several times, attributing this to the bright lights directed at the podium. The warmth from the lighting was more intense than she had anticipated, though she had spoken under similar conditions countless times before. Continuing with her speech, Kate described educational initiatives that were helping young women access higher education in countries where such opportunities had traditionally been limited to men. Her voice remained steady, but she found herself relying more heavily on her written remarks than she had planned, occasionally pausing longer than usual between sentences. The audience remained fully attentive, clearly moved by the stories Kate was sharing. Several guests nodded appreciatively as she outlined new funding mechanisms for women's health clinics in rural areas. These were programs that would make a real difference in thousands of women's lives, initiatives that justified the formal protocol and elaborate ceremony of events like tonight. As Kate moved into the final portion of her speech, she began to feel increasingly warm despite the palace's carefully controlled climate. The formal gown that had felt comfortable earlier now seemed to be retaining heat, and she could feel perspiration forming along her hairline, though her styled hair concealed this from the audience. She concluded her remarks by calling for continued collaboration between Commonwealth nations to ensure that women's voices were heard in political and economic decisions that affected their communities. The words carried genuine conviction. This was work Kate truly believed in, but delivering them required more effort than usual. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, clearly indicating that her message had resonated with the distinguished audience. Kate smiled and nodded graciously, though she was looking forward to returning to her seat and the brief respite before the cultural performance began. As she stepped away from the podium, Kate felt a slight disorientation that she attributed to the transition from bright stage lighting back to the softer ambience of the dining room. She moved carefully back toward her table, conscious of the need to maintain perfect posture and grace even when feeling less than optimal. William rose as she approached, extending his hand to help her into her chair with the gallant gesture expected in formal settings. But, as their hands touched, he immediately noticed that Kate's palm felt unusually warm and slightly damp, despite her apparently composed demeanor. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly, leaning close enough that his words wouldn't carry to nearby guests. His voice carried the careful balance of concern and discretion that characterized their public interactions when personal issues arose. Kate squeezed his hand briefly, a signal they had developed over years of public appearances that meant, "I'm managing, but stay alert." She settled back into her chair, grateful for the opportunity to sit down again, though she maintained her attentive expression as the evening's program continued. The cultural performance was about to begin, featuring traditional music and dance from across the Commonwealth. Kate usually found these presentations deeply moving, appreciating the opportunity to experience diverse cultural traditions in an intimate setting. Tonight, however, she was primarily focused on making it through the remaining portions of the evening without drawing unwanted attention to her condition. The lights dimmed slightly as performers took the stage, providing Kate with a small measure of relief from the bright illumination. She settled back in her chair, hoping that the next phase of the evening would be less demanding than the formal speeches, allowing her to regain some energy before the final reception and informal mingling that would conclude the gala. The first performers took the stage, a traditional string ensemble from Jamaica whose music filled the dining room with gentle Caribbean rhythms. Kate typically found such cultural presentations rejuvenating, connecting her to the rich heritage of Commonwealth nations she had visited and learned to appreciate deeply. Tonight, however, the music seemed to drift around her like a distant soundtrack to her internal struggle. She applauded politely as the Jamaican musicians concluded their set, though the sound of her own clapping seemed oddly muffled. Kate attributed this to the acoustics of the formal dining room, with its high ceilings and heavy drapery that absorbed sound differently than smaller performance spaces. A dance troupe from India took the stage next, their colorful costumes vibrant even in the subdued lighting. Kate had always been fascinated by classical Indian dance, having learned about its spiritual significance and technical complexity during their tour of the subcontinent. She watched the graceful movements with appreciation, though maintaining focus required conscious effort. The dancers moved through a traditional piece that told the story of seasonal changes, their flowing gestures representing wind, rain, and flowing rivers. Kate found the gentle movement somewhat hypnotic, which was both soothing and concerning as she struggled to maintain alertness. The warm lighting and soft music created an atmosphere that would normally be relaxing, but tonight felt almost overwhelming. William occasionally glanced in her direction during the performance, noting that while Kate appeared to be watching attentively, her posture remained unnaturally rigid. She typically displayed more natural movement during cultural presentations, leaning forward with interest or tilting her head thoughtfully during particularly intricate musical passages. Between performances, there was polite conversation around the table as guests shared observations about the cultural presentations. The Secretary General commented on the international recognition that Commonwealth arts programs were receiving, while other guests discussed cultural exchange initiatives in their own countries. Kate participated appropriately in these discussions, making brief but thoughtful comments about the importance of preserving traditional art forms while supporting contemporary artistic innovation. Her responses were perfectly diplomatic and well-informed, though they lacked her usual enthusiasm for topics related to arts and culture. A youth choir from South Africa performed next, their voices blending in harmonies that filled the room with powerful spiritual energy. Kate had met similar youth choirs during their visit to Cape Town, young people using music to build community connections and express hope for their future. These encounters with talented young artists were among her most cherished royal experiences. The choir's performance was deeply moving, their songs shifting from traditional folk melodies to contemporary compositions that addressed themes of unity and resilience. Several guests were visibly touched by the emotional power of the young voices, and even the most formal attendees seemed genuinely affected by the presentation. Kate felt tears forming in her eyes, though she wasn't entirely certain whether they were prompted by the beautiful music or by her increasing physical discomfort. She blinked carefully to prevent any visible emotional display while maintaining appropriate composure for the formal setting. As the South African choir concluded their set to enthusiastic applause, Kate realized that her vision was becoming slightly unfocused. The stage lighting created small halos around the performers that seemed more pronounced than usual. She rubbed her eyes discreetly, hoping to clear her vision without drawing attention. The final cultural presentation featured a contemporary dance piece choreographed collaboratively by artists from several Pacific Island nations. The performance explored themes of climate change and environmental protection, topics that resonated deeply with Kate's advocacy work and personal concerns about sustainability. The dancers moved across the stage with fluid grace, their movements representing rising sea levels and changing weather patterns that threatened island communities. Kate understood the serious message behind the artistic presentation, but found herself struggling to maintain focus on the important environmental themes being expressed. During particularly dynamic portions of the dance, the stage lighting shifted between bright and subdued tones, creating dramatic visual effects that enhanced the performance's emotional impact. Unfortunately, these lighting changes also seemed to intensify Kate's growing disorientation, though she maintained her composed expression throughout. The performance concluded to extended applause, with several guests rising to their feet in appreciation of the powerful artistic message. Kate stood with the others, though she gripped the edge of her chair briefly for support as she rose. The movement felt more effortful than it should have, but she managed to maintain her graceful posture. As the performers took their final bows and began leaving the stage, the Master of Ceremonies announced that the formal program would conclude with brief, closing remarks before guests moved to the blue drawing room for coffee and informal conversation. The prospect of several more hours of standing and socializing felt daunting to Kate, though she knew this final reception was crucial for building the personal relationships that made diplomatic work effective. Many of the most important conversations of the evening would take place during these informal interactions. Kate excused herself briefly, indicating to William with a subtle gesture that she was stepping out momentarily. Royal protocol allowed for such breaks, and her personal protection officer discreetly accompanied her toward the ladies' retiring room that had been designated for senior female guests. The walk down the corridor felt longer than usual, though Kate maintained her composure and graceful pace. The cooler air in the hallway provided some relief from the warmth of the crowded dining room, and she took several deep breaths as she moved through the familiar palace corridors. In the privacy of the retiring room, Kate finally allowed herself to acknowledge how unwell she was feeling. She sat down on the comfortable chair provided for guests and took several more deep breaths, hoping to regain some equilibrium before returning to the reception. Looking in the mirror, Kate was surprised to see that despite feeling quite unwell, her appearance remained largely unchanged. Years of professional makeup application and her natural poise helped maintain her composed look, though she could detect a slight pallor that others might not notice. She dabbed cool water on her wrists, a technique she had learned from managing stress during long public events. The cool temperature provided temporary relief, and she felt somewhat steadier as she prepared to return to the gathering. Kate's lady-in-waiting, who had been waiting discreetly outside, inquired gently about whether everything was satisfactory. Kate assured her that she was fine, though she requested that their car be prepared slightly earlier than originally planned, suggesting they might leave promptly after the essential conversations were completed. Returning to the dining room, Kate found that most guests were already beginning to move toward the blue drawing room for the reception portion of the evening. William was waiting near their table, speaking with the Canadian Prime Minister about upcoming trade discussions, but his attention immediately shifted to Kate as she rejoined them. "Better?" he asked quietly, offering his arm as they prepared to move with the other guests toward the reception area. Kate nodded and smiled, taking his arm gratefully. The brief respite had helped somewhat, though she was increasingly aware that her energy reserves were depleted. The most challenging portion of the evening was still ahead, the informal mingling that required constant attention and engagement with dozens of important guests. As they walked toward the blue drawing room, Kate steeled herself for the final phase of the evening, determined to fulfill her duties despite her physical discomfort. She had no way of knowing that the most difficult moments were still to come, and that William's support would soon be tested in ways neither of them had anticipated. The reception was beginning, and Kate prepared herself for what she hoped would be the final push through an evening that had become far more challenging than anyone could have predicted. The blue drawing room was elegantly arranged for the evening's reception, with small seating areas and standing conversation spaces that encouraged intimate discussions between guests. Crystal glasses filled with champagne and elaborate coffee service were positioned throughout the room, while staff members moved discreetly to ensure everyone's comfort. Kate entered the reception with William, maintaining her gracious smile despite the increasing effort required to appear completely at ease. The room was beautifully appointed with fresh flowers from the palace gardens and softly glowing table lamps that created a more relaxed atmosphere than the formal dining room. Their first conversation was with the Prime Minister of New Zealand and her husband, discussing upcoming cultural exchanges between British and New Zealand universities. Kate contributed meaningfully to the discussion, sharing insights from her recent meeting with university chancellors about international student programs. But as they moved through the room, Kate began to feel increasingly lightheaded. The combination of standing, socializing, and maintaining constant alertness was proving more challenging than she had anticipated. She found herself gripping William's arm more tightly than usual, though she hoped others would interpret this as normal affectionate behavior. The Australian High Commissioner approached with his wife, eager to discuss environmental conservation programs that Kate had supported during their recent Pacific tour. This was typically the kind of substantive conversation Kate enjoyed most, allowing her to discuss issues she cared about deeply while building important diplomatic relationships. Kate engaged thoughtfully with their questions about marine protection initiatives, drawing on her extensive briefings about coral reef preservation and sustainable fishing practices. But she noticed that her responses required more conscious effort than usual, and she found herself pausing longer between thoughts than felt natural. William, while maintaining his own conversation with a business leader from Kenya, kept one ear on Kate's discussion. He had developed the ability to monitor her well-being even while engaged in separate conversations, a skill that proved invaluable during long public events where they often worked different sections of a room. A small group gathered around Kate as word spread about her recent visit to a children's environmental education center. Several guests were interested in learning about programs that taught young people about climate change and conservation. Kate brightened somewhat as she described meeting enthusiastic children who were developing their own sustainability projects. But as she continued speaking, Kate became aware that her voice sounded different to her own ears, slightly distant, as though she were hearing herself speak from across the room. She maintained her warm, engaging tone, but the sensation was disconcerting and required additional concentration to manage. The conversation shifted to discuss funding mechanisms for similar educational programs in other Commonwealth nations. Kate had prepared extensively for such discussions, reviewing detailed budgets and implementation strategies with her staff. Tonight, however, accessing that information felt more difficult than usual, requiring conscious effort to recall details that normally came automatically. A server offered Kate a small cup of coffee, which she accepted gratefully, hoping the caffeine might provide some energy. The warm liquid felt soothing, though she was careful to sip it slowly to avoid any appearance of desperation for the stimulating effects. William concluded his conversation and moved closer to Kate's group, smoothly integrating himself into their discussion about youth leadership development. His presence provided additional support for the conversation while allowing him to observe Kate more closely without appearing obvious about his concern. The Secretary General of the Commonwealth approached their group, bringing with him the young climate activist from Bangladesh who had been added to the evening's guest list. Kate was genuinely pleased to meet the young woman, whose advocacy work she had followed with interest and admiration. The activist spoke passionately about her work organizing youth climate strikes in Dhaka, describing the challenges of building environmental awareness in communities struggling with immediate economic pressures. Kate listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about balancing environmental protection with economic development needs. This was exactly the kind of meaningful engagement that made royal work worthwhile, connecting with dedicated individuals who were making real differences in their communities. Kate felt energized by the young woman's passion and commitment, though maintaining the intensity of focus required was becoming increasingly difficult. As their conversation continued, Kate began to feel notably warmer than the room's temperature would justify. She discreetly used her small evening bag to fan herself slightly, hoping the movement would appear casual rather than indicating any distress. The young activist asked about Kate's own environmental advocacy work, particularly her involvement with early childhood development programs that included sustainability education. Kate began to respond enthusiastically, drawing on recent visits to schools where children were learning about recycling and energy conservation. But midway through her response, Kate felt a wave of dizziness that was stronger than anything she had experienced earlier in the evening. She paused mid-sentence, ostensibly to gather her thoughts, while actually struggling to maintain her equilibrium. The room seemed to tilt slightly, though she managed to keep this disorientation from showing on her face. William immediately noticed the pause in Kate's usually fluid conversation style. While continuing to nod appropriately at the Commonwealth Secretary General's comments about regional cooperation initiatives, he shifted slightly closer to Kate, positioning himself where he could offer support if needed. Kate resumed her response about environmental education programs, but her words came more slowly than usual. She maintained her warm, interested tone, but William could detect the extra effort she was putting into each sentence. To anyone else, she appeared completely engaged and articulate, but he recognized the signs of strain. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Kate managing to contribute meaningfully despite her increasing physical discomfort. The young activist was clearly delighted to have Kate's attention and support for her work, making the effort worthwhile despite the personal cost Kate was paying. As the group began to shift and change, with some guests moving toward other conversations while new people joined their discussion, Kate felt another, stronger wave of weakness. This time, the sensation was accompanied by a slight trembling in her hands that she tried to control by gripping her evening bag more tightly. A photographer discreetly captured images of the reception, focusing on the animated conversations taking place throughout the room. Kate was aware of the camera's presence and maintained her composed expression, knowing that these images would likely appear in newspapers and royal family social media accounts in the coming days. The Prime Minister of Canada approached with his wife, eager to continue their earlier conversation about cultural exchange programs. Kate summoned her remaining energy to engage with their questions about supporting Indigenous artists and promoting traditional crafts in international markets. But, as she spoke about successful artisan cooperatives she had visited in various Commonwealth countries, Kate began to feel increasingly disconnected from her own words. The information was accurate and her passion for the topic was genuine, but delivering her thoughts required conscious effort that was becoming harder to sustain. William noticed that Kate's grip on his arm had tightened significantly, and When he glanced at her face, he could see a slight tension around her eyes that suggested she was fighting some form of distress. To anyone else, she appeared perfectly composed and engaged, but he had learned to read the subtle signs of her discomfort. The room was becoming more crowded as additional guests arrived for the reception portion of the evening. The increased number of people contributed to a rise in both noise level and temperature, factors that made Kate's situation more challenging even though the social atmosphere became more relaxed. As Kate continued her conversation about indigenous arts programs, she became aware that her vision was becoming increasingly problematic. The faces around her seemed slightly blurred, and the elegant lighting that had created such a lovely atmosphere earlier now seemed almost overwhelming. She managed to conclude her comments about supporting traditional craftspeople with genuine warmth and interest, but internally, she was beginning to realize that she might not be able to maintain her composure for much longer. The evening that had begun with such promise was becoming a test of endurance that she was increasingly uncertain she could pass. The evening was reaching its peak social moment, with animated conversations flowing throughout the blue drawing room as guests savored the opportunity for informal discussions with fellow Commonwealth representatives. Kate found herself in conversation with the Prime Minister of Malta and several cultural ministers, discussing heritage preservation projects that protected historical sites while promoting sustainable tourism. Despite her growing physical discomfort, Kate remained genuinely interested in learning about innovative approaches to balancing conservation with economic development. The Malta representative described underwater archaeological sites that were being preserved using new diving technologies that allowed tourists to experience ancient shipwrecks without damaging them. Kate asked thoughtful questions about funding mechanisms for such projects, drawing on her knowledge of similar initiatives she had supported in other coastal nations. But as she listened to the detailed responses, she became increasingly aware that the room seemed to be getting warmer and that the conversations around her were creating a growing buzz that felt overwhelming. William finished his discussion about agricultural cooperatives with several African ministers and moved closer to Kate's conversation group. He could see that while she was maintaining perfect composure and engaging meaningfully with the important topics being discussed, there was something almost mechanical about her responses that concerned him. The conversation shifted to discuss youth engagement and heritage preservation, a topic that typically energized Kate as she spoke about young people she had met who were passionate about protecting their cultural inheritance. Tonight, however, even this subject that usually inspired her seemed to require enormous effort to address thoughtfully. A new group of guests approached, including several university chancellors who were eager to discuss educational exchange programs. Kate welcomed them warmly, grateful for any opportunity to engage with topics related to education and youth development. But as the conversation expanded to include more participants, she began to feel increasingly overwhelmed by the need to track multiple speakers and respond appropriately to various points being raised. The discussion became quite animated as the educators shared success stories from different nations about students who had benefited from international study opportunities. Kate contributed several examples from her own encounters with scholarship recipients, young people whose lives had been transformed by access to education in different Commonwealth countries. But as she spoke about a particularly inspiring young woman she had met in Jamaica who was now studying marine biology in Australia, Kate felt a pronounced wave of weakness that was stronger than anything she had experienced earlier. Her words became slightly slower, though she managed to maintain her composed demeanor. William immediately noticed the change in Kate's speaking rhythm. While continuing to nod appropriately at the education minister's enthusiastic descriptions of new program initiatives, he discreetly moved closer to Kate, positioning himself where he could provide immediate support if needed. Kate was describing the innovative research the young marine biology student was conducting when she felt her vision becoming noticeably blurred. The faces around her seemed to shift in and out of focus, and she had to concentrate intensely to maintain appropriate eye contact with the speakers. The effort required to appear normal was becoming exhausting. The room's temperature seemed to be rising, though Kate realized this was likely her own body's response to stress rather than any actual change in the palace's carefully controlled climate. She could feel perspiration forming despite the relatively cool evening, and her formal gown felt increasingly uncomfortable. A server approached offering fresh champagne, but Kate politely declined, sensing that alcohol might worsen her condition. Instead, she requested water, hoping that staying hydrated might help her maintain equilibrium for the remainder of the evening. The cool glass felt refreshing against her gloved hands. The conversation continued to flow around her, with various ministers and dignitaries sharing experiences and making connections that would likely lead to new collaborative projects between their nations. Kate understood the importance of these interactions and was determined to fulfill her role in facilitating these crucial relationships. But, as she attempted to contribute to a discussion about teacher training programs, Kate felt another strong wave of dizziness accompanied by a sensation that the floor beneath her seemed unsteady. She discreetly shifted her position, moving slightly closer to a nearby chair while maintaining her attentive expression. William caught the subtle movement and immediately understood that Kate was struggling more seriously than she had been letting on. While continuing his conversation with several business leaders about trade initiatives, he began planning how to extract Kate from the situation gracefully if her condition worsened further. The Secretary General of the Commonwealth approached Kate's group to introduce a delegation of young entrepreneurs who had recently received international recognition for their sustainable business innovations. Kate brightened as she always did when meeting accomplished young people, but the effort required to focus on their achievements was becoming increasingly difficult. She listened attentively as they described their work developing renewable energy solutions for rural communities, asking thoughtful questions about scaling their innovations and accessing international markets. These were exactly the kinds of initiatives that Kate's advocacy work was designed to support, making the conversation personally meaningful despite her physical distress. But, as the young entrepreneurs continued their presentations, Kate began to feel increasingly disconnected from her surroundings. The room seemed to be taking on an ethereal quality, with voices becoming slightly muffled and the elegant lighting appearing almost dreamlike. She gripped her evening bag more tightly, using it as an anchor to reality. One of the young entrepreneurs asked Kate about her own experiences with environmental advocacy, particularly her work promoting sustainable practices in early childhood education. Kate began to respond, drawing on recent visits to innovative green schools she had supported, but her words came more slowly than usual. William noticed that Kate's responses, while still appropriate and thoughtful, were taking longer to formulate than was typical for her. She normally spoke with fluent confidence about topics she cared about, but tonight there was a hesitation that suggested she was having difficulty accessing information that should have been readily available. As Kate continued discussing environmental education initiatives, she felt her balance becoming increasingly precarious. The elegant heels she had worn countless times before now seemed difficult to manage, and she found herself relying more heavily on William's arm for stability. The conversation around her continued to flow, with guests sharing experiences and making plans for future collaborations. Kate understood that these were exactly the kinds of interactions that made such events worthwhile, real relationships being formed that would lead to meaningful projects benefiting Commonwealth citizens. But, as she attempted to contribute to a discussion about funding mechanisms for youth environmental programs, Kate felt the most severe wave of weakness yet. The room seemed to tilt dramatically, and she struggled to maintain her footing. Her vision became significantly blurred, and the voices around her seemed to fade into background noise. William immediately sensed the change in Kate's condition. Without breaking his conversation or drawing attention to the situation, he smoothly moved to provide more substantial support, his arm positioning itself more securely around her while maintaining the appearance of normal affectionate contact between a married couple. Kate tried to continue speaking about the environmental programs, but her words became noticeably slower and less coherent. She could hear herself talking but felt increasingly disconnected from the process of forming thoughts and expressing them clearly. The effort required to appear normal was becoming overwhelming. The room began to sway more dramatically, and Kate realized that she was no longer able to maintain her composed facade. Despite her determination to fulfill her duties, her body was reaching the limits of what it could endure. She gripped William's arm tightly, a signal they had never needed before, but one he understood instinctively. Without missing a beat in his ongoing conversation, William began the delicate process of extracting them from the social situation. He smoothly concluded his remarks to the business leaders while simultaneously beginning to guide Kate toward a less crowded area of the room where they might have more privacy to address her condition. But before they could move more than a few steps, Kate felt her knees beginning to buckle. The combination of exhaustion, stress, and whatever physical issues she had been fighting throughout the evening finally overwhelmed her ability to maintain control. Despite all her training and determination, she was about to collapse in front of the most important diplomatic gathering of the year. William realized what was happening and, in one fluid motion, stepped forward to catch Kate as her legs gave way. His quick reflexes and intimate knowledge of his wife's condition allowed him to support her weight while making the assistance appear like a natural, caring gesture rather than an emergency intervention. To the other guests, it appeared that Kate had simply needed to sit down for a moment, with William gallantly helping her to a nearby chair. His calm, unhurried movements gave no indication of crisis, protecting Kate's dignity while ensuring her safety. The surrounding conversations continued without interruption, as most guests remained unaware that anything unusual had occurred. But William knew that Kate's condition was serious enough to require immediate attention. As he helped her settle into the chair, he could see the pallor in her face and feel the trembling in her hands that she could no longer control. The evening that had begun with such promise had become a medical emergency that would require all of his diplomatic skills to manage discreetly while ensuring Kate received the care she needed.